There's two houses to show you on the ranch today, one very modern and one very historic, but both are critically important to our family's life. Now this house is very old, built sometime in the late 1800s, turn of the century, but it's got fun elements to it. There's an outdoor kitchen, an indoor kitchen, and no electricity and no running water. All packed into a 16 by 20 frame, with hidden nooks and crannies throughout, handmade furniture, wood-burning cook stove, a hidden root cellar, and mountains of collected cookware. So let's go for a quick tour and talk about how we light it with no electricity, how dishes get washed with no kitchen sink, and how we cook, eat, and play here in a house that was rotting into the ground. But this house doesn't exist just for kicks. It has to pull its weight and earn its keep on an old family ranch. And by request, we'll show you another ranch building doing its share to keep the family land going for hopefully one more generation. We rebuilt this entire 1889 homestead cabin last year, so we've got tons of little bits and scraps left over. We use those scraps to cook. Now, what are we doing cooking in the middle of nowhere? Well, it's mostly for personal obsession and love of history, but I get to keep doing it by justifying it as agro-tourism. Before I ramble on too much about that, let's do a 360-degree tour of this whole house so you can see head to toe, top to bottom, what is inside this thing. It's a one-room cabin. This is not going to take long, but it is packed full of all sorts of neat treasures. What a 360 doesn't capture is the hidden root cellar below and the rafters above, but we'll dive into those next. Each part of this house has a very specific function. If it's not useful, it's not in here. Now we started by the front door, well, really the only door, as we walked in and looked south. That's the part we never show, because it's where we hide all the junk, the kids' toys, tripods, rags, random candle-making supplies, that stuff. It's not glamorous, but hey, it is a part of life. You'll see a handmade ironing board for when we sew on the old treadle out here, and a desk for when Maggie does her schoolwork with me out here. So this half of the house is the leisure side of the one-room shack. Now to do that, a place to recline and rest is key, hence homemade bunk beds. Now Robbie whipped these together as a surprise when we spent our first night out here. It was the day after we finally got an old door back on the house. The door itself is the original 1800s door, just beefed up a bit with fir backing boards so that the wind whistles through it a little less than it used to. That's half the house down. That's Brad, by the way. He's one of the good friends who helped rebuild this house. On to the real cooking and working side of the house. This west wall has only one window because it gets the brutal weather on it. So much so that back in the day, they just boarded over it. Wind, driving snow, this spot on the prairie is entirely unprotected. In addition to the bunk beds, here marks the switch to the cooking side of things, the real working part of the cabin. Now a handmade plate rack whipped together from boards reclaimed from the old house hangs on the wall. Pewter given to us by our friend Cindy, plates from my grandparents, bowls from the coolest historical reenactment website, James Townsend & Son, as well as products my friends and I make right here in small workshops in Montana. Click the link to check them out. This wall is full of treasures. It's very functional, but I'd also say it's very beautiful. Cast iron hangs proudly from this wall. There's lots of old, but some new. Working tools here are a shrine to utilitarianism. Okay, on to my favorite wall, the showstopper. This is board for board, nail for nail, the original wall that has stood here since 1889. We literally pulled it away, totally intact, during the renovation, and then we raised it back up intact on the rebuilt stone foundation. Its character is perfect, and on it stands the beating heart of this whole place, the wood-burning cook stove. This one is from the early 1900s, and I could wax on about its beauty all day. It's wonderful and it's difficult all at the same time. I'm still learning its quirks. Every stove has its own personality, as a wonderful viewer said. It's like having a friend with you in the kitchen every time you cook. They're just like anything else, but unlike our modern world, they're pretty indestructible, but you kind of have to keep up with cleaning them out, making sure there's just enough ash but not too much. It's important to come through regularly with steel wool, and I'm just buffing the surface to get any of those old bits of grease and gunk that have baked onto a black Kind of makes the stove look neat and tidy and beautiful, which of course would have been as important to a pioneer as it is to us today. Kind of speaks to how you are as a cook, right? And finally, our last stop on the 360-degree tour is the countertop where we chop, wash dishes, and mix dough. We whacked this together out of pine trees from the ranch, painted it with old-fashioned sour milk paint, and we don't baby it. The only other spot to work in this kitchen is the kitchen table. This is the most rustic kitchen table in the world. It could win awards. Its craftsmanship is so minimal it's almost comical, but we dragged it out of a caving-in homestead on the far side of the ranch, and I love it. The circle saw marks, the aged wood, the proportions, it's all just right for this place. Just throw it straight out the front door. Straight out the front door. We've forgotten two things here though, to look up and to look down. Looking up, you'll see exposed roof rafters. Now originally the house had a ceiling on it, but all the boards had been lost when the house was turned into a grain bin in the 1930s. So we rebuilt the roof and we left it open. It gives a great place to hang herbs and the handmade chandelier, crafted with master ability by a friend and renowned blacksmith George Ainsley, who has sadly left us. His work lives on though, and I never look at it without smiling. The prairie rock roses on its surround have special meaning to me. Now, what's down below our feet? Well, a hidden trapdoor leads to a 22-ton stone foundation laid by my hands last summer. The kids helped, Robbie delivered the stone. It was a massive family project. It's imperfect, but it brings delight. It's strong, it's laid according to ancient principles, and it gives us a secret spot for cold storage. Now, wildly, it's full of snow right now in the deep winter. So yeah, it's not a perfect root cellar. But in the fall, I can store milk and lard down underneath it, and it works great. But for its primitive use as a cold storage space, I will take it. I'd love to build a proper dugout cellar into the hillbank one day, lime wash the stone walls. There's lots of dreams still to go. There's people out there who remember just how important a root cellar was to survival. Now, reading the comments and hearing their stories is part of the delight of this channel. There are people who still remember. I'd encourage anyone who loves history to dive into that comment section and read the experiences that people can still remember. History is very much still alive. This house, of course, was abandoned for 80 years before we decided we couldn't let it melt into the ground forever. So we started off having no idea what it would be used for in the future. We just jumped in, milled boards, stacked stones, and long story short, this is what it looks like now. So we've seen all four walls, the stone cold space, but this house is only a shell unless a person knows how to light it, how to cook correctly with the tools, and keep clean the old-fashioned way. The lighting is all oil or handmade candles. This house has no electricity to it. The power lines came straight through this valley in the 1940s, but they never stopped here. This house was already abandoned by then. A little fat, a little beeswax, and days of work, made using tin molds and tallow, rendered right here on the outdoor fire, of course. That is what it takes to stay up after sundown. If you've never tried reading and eating by lamplight, I highly recommend it. I lived 8 years of my life exclusively this way. It's pure magic. Okay, how do we wash dishes in this cabin? There's no running water. Well, whenever possible, we do it by daylight. We haul our water in, and we use metal dish pans over the fire. When the water gets too hot, we put the pans on the floor or the counter, and when it gets too cold, we put it back on the stove. This method works well, but it's probably the #1 modern luxury that I miss. Running water is such a gift. It's good for the kids to learn to be grateful for the little things. I will say that I think of this whole process as a time machine, and the best way to feel what life was like back in history is through architecture and food. If I can grab a cast iron skillet and look at a wall full of age marks and stories, while I taste food cooked just like it was 100 years ago, well, I'm transported. And that's something pretty special today. But how I justify coming out here day after day, cooking with the kids, or even luxuriously all alone, is that this little cabin brings in a tiny bit of diversified income for the ranch. It's nothing big, nothing earth-shattering, but it's enough that if a crop gets hailed out or we need a little extra something, this house and the other house on the ranch help to cover those costs. But the other house does it in a completely different way. It's the polar opposite of this house. Well, it's still small and primitive in its architecture, but it has every luxury in the book, and we prepared it for people to come stay in it. As you walk inside, you go through a homemade door and past dovetailed log walls. It's a 20 by 20 log pen that reaches heights of 16 feet. Robbie milled and stacked all of the logs. Each one was from a tree right here on the land. The vast pine forests of Montana are perfect for this kind of architecture. The large open space has a loft built into it. That allows for an upstairs viewing spot and sleeping area that every kid dreams about. We added cool features like a hand-painted headboard and fine furniture made ourselves. A good part of summer is spent changing sheets and prepping the house for guests coming and going on the ranch. It's absolutely worth it though, because we have met incredible people by doing this work. From Australia to Scotland to Canada, this house attracts fellow traditional architecture enthusiasts who love nature. Heck, we even had one of the stars of TV's Yellowstone spend their birthday here. They spent 6 days and never left the house or ran to town once, which means that this little house is a self-sufficient hideaway on the ranch. And we built it from the ground up with exactly that goal in mind. Agritourism is the label for it, but it basically means bringing people to us, to this ranch, as a source of income and stability. It diversifies the place so that the storms of trade, tariffs, and markets can't crush us in one fell swoop. I'm pretty introverted, but connecting with people from all over the map has added an especially satisfying element. And that extra income makes the ranch just that little bit more secure. Now, I'd gladly live in either one of these houses. Maybe one day we will. But for now, they're workhorses on the ranch, allowing us to keep going. The log house is more private, it's true, but the 1889 homestead house is the one you may already be familiar with, whether you watched us rebuild it last year or you come for the cooking and pioneer skills videos. This is the place we come to constantly. If you want to see more about it, click into the playlist, subscribe. There's so much to explore about this humble spot. But thanks for coming along as we toured both houses. I'm off to pickle red onions in a giant crock so that we can cook pulled porcupine sliders, a survival food forgotten to time, together next weekend. Cheers.